Hi once more. Here we are to talk about the government today and how they spend and so on, so forth, and what have you. So we've got a lot of stuff to talk about, and we'll just jump right into it, right? Because we're at the point in the semester where you're probably ready to be done. Yes. So may as well get going with that. All right, back up to the whiteboard. And so for government, we're going to talk about first 3 types of government spending. All right, and the first type, so these are, okay. I'm doing Roman numerals here, but they're not showing up like on the board when I write them. So there's public goods. Second one is externalities. And the third one transfer payments. All right, so first type, public goods. Public goods, these are things like fire, police, military, education, things like that. All right, those, and what these types of goods do, these benefit the entire public, but are difficult to charge individually for usage. So they benefit the entire public. Obviously, it's beneficial to have an education system that makes a more educated public, to have police to protect us, to have military to protect our borders and things like that. But it's impossible or difficult to go around and figure out how much police did you need this week? How much protection did you need? Did your house catch on fire? No. Well, what was the risk of it catching on fire? Because why then did you have how much did you benefit from the fire department? Things of that nature. So with those kind of things, it would be impossible to go around and charge everyone individually, but yet somebody's got to pay the bill. So it's becomes a public good. There is little to no competition in this arena. So these have basically a monopoly on their services. There's some competition, like with police, you can hire security firms and things like that. There's private school versus public school, but very little competition there. So instead, these are paid through taxes. And since it is impossible to assess the valuation by each consumer, they provide to everyone equally. All right, so it's impossible to assess. So if you live in a high crime area, then perhaps you might value the police protection higher. But if you don't, you wouldn't. So in other words, but they protect everyone equally, so we'll just, put it across the board equally. But that brings up a problem here. Since they're paid through taxes, not everyone pays taxes, do they? So that brings up a problem of free riders. You all know what those are, right? Folks that benefit without paying. And this leads us to something also called the underground economy. And the underground economy has many, many forms, but it's made up of illegal industries, tax evasion, things of that nature. So things that are illegal and you don't pay, you want to avoid your taxes. And then free riders benefit without paying. A lot of people have an issue with that. Personally, I think that people need a stake in their government. I don't think I think it's undignified for people to feel like they're just taking without contributing anything. So I would think that most people within their core, they don't want to be free riders. And so so that's a problem for all of us, okay? And we're not just talking about people who can't pay or poverty, which we'll talk about in a moment, but just for their own dignity and their own need to feel important and significant. Okay, so next, let's talk about how to determine cost versus value. So in other words, who's the public? We're talking about public goods. Well, who is exactly the public? So something we use a median voter model. And the median voter model these talk about the folks that are in the middle of the road. It says most folks are in the middle of the road. They're just the median. And this model, the success of it depends on the preference of the median to dominate. So what I mean is usually the middle of the road dominates. When you hear people talk about, now we're getting in politics, and I like to keep economics separate from that, okay, because it muddies the water, so we don't want to do that. So try to hear the economic theory behind this instead of the political theory. But I think that most people, and you may disagree with this, but hear me out for a moment, are in the median folks. They're the middle of the road. They're moderates. And they usually those are the ones that come out and vote in elections, typically, and their preference gets hurt. Typically, the ones who are either extreme one way or extreme the other, that's a very small group of people. It's smaller than you might think. So I think the middle of the road folks are the ones that tend to dominate and figure out, and that's the preference that comes out. But instead, what we end up hearing, more political rhetoric. And political rhetoric, these are persuasive terms such as middle class, hardworking Americans, American families, and things of that nature. So these persuasive terms meant to sway opinion. I think I went over the side. No, I got it all on there. Okay. So these are persuasive terms. They're meant to sway opinion. So if you say the hardworking Americans or American families, then people are going to say, yes, that's me. I'm a hardworking American. But really, and then a lot of people stop listening at that point. So after they stop listening at that point, then they end up being swayed perhaps to something that's not really what they wanted. So political rhetoric is something you've got to learn to look beyond. So therefore, the conclusion is that most voters pay too much or too little, as opposed to private markets, which use demand and supply to reach optimum efficiency pricing. Okay, so what happens then, because there's this political rhetoric, and because there's this things like that, special interest groups getting involved and all, and swaying the voting and lobbying and everything other than just what these median voters want, most voters end up paying too much or too little in their taxes for these goods and services. Private markets, on the other hand, are using demand and supply. Demand and supply has been proven over and over and over and over and over again to be optimum, to be more efficient. So our system that we've got going on here, is not giving us a fair price. Now, what we know, what we have already learned is that we know already, we know that consumers maximize their utility, right? We know that businesses maximize profit. But what about government? Well, governments have a goal too. Now, the government is of the people, by the people, for the people, so on and so forth. But those elected officials have made that their career, so what they want to do is to get elected. So governments maximize political support. And this does come from Adam Smith's theory of rational self-interest. Adam Smith has a theory that it is very rational. We were talking about how that we talked about how we are all out for our own self-interest, and that put together that works out fine. Well, here's the exception for that. And then this comes from the rational self-interest. It is rational to want to do what's best for you. That's rational. That is what a rational human being would think. But sometimes with this government, your job, the problem with the government is your job is to do what's best for a collective group of people, not just yourself. So that's where the theory breaks down. If these people are truly looking out, I mean, if they didn't have a job where they were supposed to look out for the welfare of everyone, then the theory would make more sense than it does. But let's go onward then. All right, so let's talk about the problems. The first problem is one of rational ignorance. I love the name for this. Rational ignorance is that voters expect no benefit from legislation, so they choose to remain ignorant. Now, I'm sorry, folks, I'm going to have to raise my hand on this one too. We are so inundated these days with news media and just different things going on, and this person mad at that person, and this person having a fight with this person, and all that stuff, that you know the temptation is there to say, well, this isn't going to benefit me anyway, so I'm just not going to pay attention to it. That's the theory of rational ignorance. That's it. You're being ignorant, but you're doing it for a rational reason. Okay, you've got a reason. You've got a good reason for being ignorant. And so what you're saying is the cost of gathering info and voting is greater than the marginal benefit of legislation. So what it's going to take you, and I raise my hand on that, because when I'm going to go over something in class, if there's some legislation that's going on or something, and I'm trying to figure it out, and so I want to go over it in class, and I'm looking for some objective reporting that's not from the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, but that's just out there, objective. It's so hard to find. So for people to try to go and find that, and then go and vote based on what they found, there's a high cost involved with that. There's a high cost for your time, for your the headaches you get, and things of that nature. And that's greater than any benefit you may get from the legislation they're voting on. You're saying it's not going to affect me anyway, so I'm not going to put the time in. And that is rational. That's a rational, you've come to a rational conclusion based on the facts. Nobody argues with that. Special interest legislation. Now, I do vote. I will tell you that. I do vote, and I do think that we should all make the effort. More to be good citizens than because we actually believe we will benefit. But, who knows? So special interest legislation. This is concentrated benefits, widespread costs. So concentrated benefits. So that's the benefit. It would benefit a few, but it costs the entire population. So an example, and this one might not necessarily be the best example, but it's the one that came to mind and it's the least controversial. Farm subsidies. So propping up the farmers and using tax dollars to help farmers produce, that would have some concentrated benefits for the farmers, but it's widespread costs. Everybody's taxes go into that pot to help the farmers. And if you might not be in an area where it's highly agricultural, so you're not going to, you're not going to see a lot of those benefits, but yet you're still paying the cost for that. So that's some of the things there. You have a lot of that in your rural areas versus your urban areas too. And where do we spend tax dollars for the entire state? Who's going to get the benefits of that? So there's those types of issues. Generally speaking, these are harmful to the economy as a whole because the total costs of them are greater than the total benefits. All right, so generally these are harmful to the economy as a whole. The total cost, it costs the entire economy, but it's not benefiting the entire economy. So it's generally harmful. In fact, somebody has said that there are three political parties in the United States, and that's the Democrats, the Republicans, and the special interest groups. Unfortunately, the special interest groups, they have a lot of lobbies, so they certainly are making their voice known as opposed to the others. This is also what's called pork barrel spending. And what happens, Congress will support these to get reelected and gathers favors for their election. All right, so Congress supports the pork barrel spending to get reelected and gathers favors for their election. All right, now here's another problem with this. Here's where the economics comes in. The problems is that it wastes resources because it does nothing to boost GDP. So it does not increase GDP at all. So therefore, it's not helping the economy. It's wasting resources. In fact, it usually decreases GDP. All right, so it's really just a drain on the economy. Okay, so how that works. So if you have special interest programs increase and taxes increase, pay for it. So you have the special interest programs increase, taxes increase to pay for it. Then consumption decreases, investment decreases, and GDP also decreases. Another problem here with this is that special interests have no incentive to make government more efficient. So special interest groups, these have no incentive. So you've got the programs are enacted, they increase, you got to have taxes to pay for them. And then, of course, with less money in their pocket, they're going to have less consumption, less investment, and a lower GDP. So it's not exactly the best thing in the world for the economy, is it? Not necessarily. All right, so let's take a look at the farm subsidies here. The farm subsidies that we talked about these are really just price floors, okay? And so let's see what that does to the economy. So you have your demand and your supply, and let me label those. All right, so your demand and your supply, and then you end up with an equilibrium price right here. Right? Equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. Okay, so instead of that, so instead of having things go to equilibrium, what the government says is they know the prices can't go below a certain level. So let's say that it goes, let's say the prices can't fall below here. So we've got our price floor. And what we're going to end up with that, we're going to have, this is going to be your quantity demanded. This right here is going to be your quantity supplied. And if you'll look, can't draw those brackets, can I? So you're going to have quantity supplied greater than quantity demanded, which means surplus. All right, but then that's not all, is it? That is not all. So the government, which is the taxpayers, purchase the excess supply. So governments purchase the excess supply. So you're paying twice. In other words, you're having to pay higher prices. You're having to pay the higher prices at the supermarket, and then you're paying a second time over here. This is where the problem comes in, and this is where this is inefficient, because this is money that should be used to purchase more goods and services to boost GDP and keep the economy going. Instead, what we're doing is it's just money that's kind of wasted, to be honest. These have been in place so long that they don't even, they don't even know how to do otherwise. I can't even imagine how they would fix this, but these have been in place forever. All right, now we talked a little bit more about this. We talked about economic rent before, but another form of rents, these are special advantages or subsidies sought after by special interest groups. So when these special subsidies that the farmers get are called rents. Now, the problem is you can have these groups become rent-seeking. So the special interest groups, instead of trying to so they started out with these saying, okay, well, we need this because we're going through a hard time, or we need this to keep this industry alive because it benefits us, and so on and so forth. And they talk about that, but instead, what happens is now they are actively seeking these. So they're engaging in activity to secure rents instead of having really a good reason. And this activity is called lobbying. And lobbying is usually done by political action committees, or PACs. So PACs are political action committees, and 7 out of the top 10 of these are labor unions. And 7 out of 10 of these are for labor union. These waste resources also. So what some folks have come up with, an idea that some folks have come up with, is something called privatization. It's not a new idea. This has been around a while, but some of you may have heard it or you may not have heard it. And so we'll talk about it a little bit. And privatization is turning government-provided goods and services over to the private sector. So what you're doing, privatization, letting the business community provide it. Now, are they any better than the government? Well, they operate more efficiently. Let's take a look at some of these things, some of these reasons why that might be a good idea. First, they use demand and supply to set prices. So therefore, prices will be set at optimum level by demand and supply. All right, so they operate more efficiently. They use demand and supply to set prices. If there's a service the government is providing that is no longer useful or beneficial, it will be winnowed out through demand and supply. That may seem harsh because you've got this tiny, tiny small group of people that are benefiting from that. But does it make sense to penalize this entire millions and billions of people for that? Is there a better way? Perhaps it can be covered by the private sector. If it is important to people, can they not? For example, we were talking about a few years ago, we were talking about music and art in school. Now, I have a daughter who's going to an art school, so I am fully in support of teaching art in school. However, why not pay, what about having some of that and maybe perhaps getting some some local companies and all to pay for that? Just see what happens. When the government shut down several years ago, several local businesses chipped in to pay for childcare and spousal benefits for military who had fallen soldiers, things like that. And they did that because they knew that it benefit, and even if they were doing it just to be selfish, does it matter? If they did that to benefit, just themselves, does it matter as long as people get help? The motivation isn't matter so much as the results in those cases. So, perhaps might not be the worst thing to think about. So it lessens and eliminates free riders, right? And I'm saying that that's good for the free riders too. You don't need to be a free rider. That's taking away your dignity, and that's not a good thing. There's more incentive toward customer satisfaction. So there's a lot of government programs that, hey, we are just not happy with the service we're getting. So if it's in the private sector and there's competition, then they have to make us happy, right? Because they don't want us to leave. All right, and then there is the ability to earn profit. The ability to earn profit, and that is because you have greater efficiency equals lower total cost, and then higher total revenue, thus more profit. So they have an incentive towards efficiency. All right, so let's put that there. Incentive toward efficiency, and that's good for us. So they have the ability to earn profit. That leads them to being more efficient. Also, we eliminate shortages and surpluses, thus less wasted resources. All right. Right now, here's another. The government is its own monopoly, which means it is inefficient, we've already talked about, but it's worth saying again, with captive customers. And by that, I mean no one can refuse to pay. No one can refuse to pay. They will come and get you and force you to pay. So you have captive customers. That lends itself to be inefficient and without customer satisfaction. And then the last one I'm going to put up here is the opportunity for competition leading to greater customer satisfaction. And again, efficiency. Now, I know I put some things up there that are a bit repetitive, but I think it bears mentioning again because there are different routes we take to get there. If we're inefficient because of free riders, because there's no ability to earn profit because the government is own monopoly, that all leads to us being inefficient, but that's 3 good reasons why we why privatization is something that we might want to look at. Also, I have this article here, and I'm going to read you. There were several companies that, after the Atlanta public school scandal, the one where they had changed the test scores and cheated and everything, and then they went through and finally found a superintendent that they were looking forward to come in, but there was a large cost involved in that. So there were several companies, 9 companies as a matter of fact, that donated some money to a fund for this superintendent to use to cover these costs, to get things back on track again. And these were companies like Bank of America, Delta, Emory, Georgia Power, SunTrust, Coca-Cola, some of those different ones. And they do that. Now, maybe they're doing it to be selfish. Maybe they're doing it because they don't want their employees to have to deal with it, or they don't want anything to keep them from showing up to work. Perhaps so. But even with that being the case, that definitely is still a good thing to do. And it doesn't negate my point that if they're doing that to help out, whether they're doing it for selfish or unselfish reasons, doesn't matter. The point is it's being done. It's being done. All right, so I'm actually going to stop right there because this is going to be a lot of information at once, and that way you won't have to pause it. So I'm going to come back and do externalities and transfer payments all together at another time because I need to take a break, and I think you probably do too. So we'll get that coming next time, and in the meanwhile, just kind of let all this marinate with you. See what you think about it, and I'll see you next time.